The official report called it an accident. A tragic, regrettable accident of war. A lone bomber, lost, confused, out. Suffering a catastrophic mechanical failure over a remote stretch of the Burmese jungle. That was the story signed, stamped, and filed away in the archives. But the men who were there, out. The ones who felt the concussion of the blast wave and saw the pillar of fire claw its way into the night sky. They knew the truth. There was no accident. That explosion was a surgical strike, a precise, deliberate lout, an impossible act of vengeance carried out by a machine everyone had written off. This is not a story about a famous ace in a legendary fighter. This is a story about the underdog, about a plane so maligned, so ridiculed that its own pilots dreaded flying it, an aircraft dubbed a flying coffin, a death trap, a mechanized insult, the Bristol Blenheim. By 1941, it was obsolete, underpowered, underarmed, a slow and vulnerable target. Command saw it as expendable. The enemy saw it as easy prey. But on one moonless night, a broken plane and a desperate crew would turn its greatest weakness into a devastating weapon, rewriting a single page of the war in a fireball that lit up the jungle for miles out. To understand how a declared failure achieved the impossible, we have to go back to the beginning, to the drawing board, to the gleaming promises of peace, and to the brutal reality of a war this aircraft was never designed to fight. It began not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of luxury and speed. In the mid-1930s, the Bristol Aeroplane Company, seeking a prestigious project, designed a sleek, all-metal, twin-engine monoplane to carry 8 wealthy passengers in comfort. It was called the Type 142, and it was a marvel. So fast that during a demonstration flight for the Royal Air Force, it effortlessly outpaced every fighter biplane they sent up to intercept it. The military minds were stunned out. This civilian airliner was faster than their frontline defenders out. They immediately saw past the leather seats and walnut trim. They saw a skeleton, a frame upon which they could hang bombs. In a fever of conversion, they took the blueprints, stripped out the plush accommodations, and sketched in a bomb bay, a glazed nose for a bombardier, and a solitary, frail-looking machine gun turret on its back. They baptized it the Blenheim MKI, and it entered service as the new vanguard of British air power, the world's first modern, all-metal, cantilever, wing monoplane medium bomber. The press loved it. Politicians praised it. It was fast, it was modern, it was a psychological terror weapon, meant to showcase British industrial might. But in their rush to field this wonder weapon, they made compromises, fatal ones. To save weight and keep that headline, grabbing speed, they skimped on armor. The fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. The airframe was thin, and that defensive armament, a single 303 caliber Vickers K gun in that turret, and maybe another fixed gun firing forward, lout. It was a peacetime design thrust into a war that was about to redefine brutality in the skies. Because while the Blenheim was being paraded for the cameras, a very different kind of war machine was rolling off assembly lines in Nazi Germany. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, a purebred predator, designed from the ground up for one purpose, to destroy other aircraft. It was smaller, more agile, and armed with a combination of machine guns and devastating 20 mm cannons that could shred aluminum from 1,000 yards. When war finally broke out in September 1939, the mismatch was instant and horrifying. Blenheims, sent on daring daylight raids over Germany, found their speed advantage had evaporated. The 109s were faster, but they climbed quicker. And when they attacked, it wasn't a duel. It was a slaughter. The Blenheim's thin skin offered no protection out. Its solitary pop gun turret was useless against a slashing attack from the front or below. Cannon shells would walk down the wing, erupting the non-self-sealing fuel tanks into instant fireballs. Crews gave it those grim nicknames: the Flying Coffin, the Poor Man's Last Ride. Losses were catastrophic. On one of the very first raids of the war, a force of Blenheims attacking German shipping lost 5 out of 11 aircraft out. The writing was on the wall, written in the smoke trails of falling bombers. The wonder weapon was a death trap. But the war didn't stop. There were no replacements. So the Blenheims kept flying, and the crews kept dying. Mission after terrible mission. They were pushed from the forefront of the war over Europe to secondary theaters, the sun-baked deserts of North Africa, the malaria-haunted jungles of the Far East. It was to one of these forgotten corners of the war that our story now turns. To a dusty, monsoon-lashed airfield in northeastern India, and to a crew who believed they'd been handed a death sentence. At airfield number 17, a miserable strip of packed earth carved from tea plantations near the Brahmaputra River out. The mood was one of quiet despair. The monsoon rains had turned the perimeter into a quagmire out, and the humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, rusting everything it touched. In a makeshift operations hut out, its walls stained with mold, Flight Lieutenant James McAllister stared at the mission packet on the rough wooden table out. He was 24, but his eyes looked a decade older. A veteran of the doomed attempts to stop the Japanese advance through Malaya, he'd seen what Zeros did to Hudsons and Wirraways, and now they were giving him a Blenheim, not even the slightly improved MKIV, but a wary, patched-up MKI serial number L8752. Its paint was faded. Oil streaks stained its engine nacelles, and a pungent smell of mildew, cordite, and fear lived permanently in its fuselage. The ground crew, a perpetually exhausted sergeant named Jenkins, had been blunt. The port engine's mag drops are erratic out, sir. Starboard oil pressure fluctuates if you look at it funny. The hydraulics for the turret are leaking again out. And the radios, well, you're better off with 2 tin cans and a string. Mac's crew mirrored his own grim assessment. His observer and navigator, Flying Officer Arthur Book Bellingham out, was a former geography teacher with a mind like a filing cabinet. He could reckon through a typhoon out, but his hands shook slightly as he traced the proposed route on the map. The wireless operator air gunner, Sergeant Pete Gremlin Jones, was a wary 19-year-old from Liverpool whose technical ingenuity was matched only by his deep, superstitious dread of their assigned aircraft, which he had already christened the Jinx. Their mission was a familiar and hated one, a long-range, low-level reconnaissance sweep over Japanese-held territory in northern Burma. Intel suggested the Japanese were building up supplies near a place called Ma-Yit-Gina, possibly for a push into India. The Blenheim was to slip in at treetop level, photograph anything it saw, and slip out. No bombs. Just eyes. A sitting duck's job for a flying coffin. It's a milk run, the squadron leader had said with forced cheer, avoiding their eyes. Just stay low, stay fast, and don't linger. As they walked out to the aircraft in the pre-dawn gloom, the smell of damp earth and aviation fuel in the air, Gremlin Jones muttered what they all felt. Low and fast in this old girl. That's like asking a 3-legged cow to win the Grand National. The The first hour of the flight was a tense symphony of straining engines and constant vigilance. Mac wrestled with the controls. The Blenheim felt heavy, sluggish, unresponsive. They crossed into Burmese airspace as the sun began to bleed light over the mist-shrouded hills out, flying so low that the jungle canopy was a dizzying green blur beneath their wings. Mac could see individual trees, the flash of a river. This was the Blenheim's one remaining trick: its low, level stability. It could, in theory, hedge, hop beneath enemy radar and fighter patrols. Theory. Book Bellingham navigated with calm precision, his face lit by the soft glow of his instruments. Course holding Mac out. River should be coming up on the port side there. Gremlin was a ball of nervous energy in the draughty, cramped turret. Slowly rotating it, his eyes scanning the brightening sky. The drone of the engines was hypnotic, a mechanical lullaby that couldn't quite mask the thrum of fear. They were alone in a vast, hostile sky. Then, the first of the promised gremlins struck. A sharp, metallic bang from the port engine, followed by a sudden, violent shudder that shook the entire airframe. The engine RPM needle swung wildly, and a thick, black plume of oil smeared itself across the wing and windshield. Mac's stomach turned to ice. Port engine out. Severe oil pressure drop! Feathering prop! His hands moved with practiced, desperate speed, pulling the engine cut off out, hitting the feathering button. The shuddering lessened as the propeller blades twisted parallel to the wind, reducing drag. But they had just lost half their power. The Blenheim, already struggling, began a slow, inexorable descent. The jungle seemed to rise up to meet them. Mac shoved the remaining throttle to the firewall, nursing the starboard engine out. Book new calculations. We can't maintain altitude on 1. What's our abort point? Before Bellingham could answer, Gremlin's voice, high and tight, crackled over the intercom. Bandits! Bandits! 6 o'clock high! 2 of them! Coming down like bloomin' hawks. Mac's blood ran cold. He glanced in the small rear view mirror. 2 sleek, dark shapes had broken out of a cloud bank, their profiles unmistakable Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. The most agile, deadly fighter in the Pacific theater, and they had seen the smoking, crippled Blenheim. This was it, Lout. The flying Coffin's final trip. The Zeros didn't bother with complex tactics. They had all the advantages, Lout. The lead Zero peeled off into a steep, diving attack from the rear quarter. Mac did the only thing he could out. He hauled the heavy bomber into a shallow, diving turn toward the jungle, seeking the meager sanctuary of the treetops. Our Gremlin, hold fire until he's committed! Aim for the engine! The world dissolved into noise and violence. Tracer fire from the Zero's 7mm machine guns streaked past the canopy, glowing lines of death. Mac could hear the thump, thump, thump of Gremlin's single 303 gun returning fire. A pathetic pop, gun against the Predator's teeth. Cannon shells from the Zero's 20 nummy wings ripped through their port wing out, tearing great gouts of metal. The aircraft bucked like a wild horse. A line of fire stitched across the fuselage behind Mac, Lout, and he felt a searing pain across his shoulder. The acrid smell of smoke and spilled fuel filled the cockpit. The second Zero came in from the side. More cannon hits. The starboard engine began to cough and sputter. Instruments shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed. The Blenheim was being torn apart around them. We're on fire! Starboard wing root. Book yelled. Through the smoke and chaos, Mac saw the lead Zero pull up for another pass. The pilot was confident, taking his time. This was the kill shot, and in that moment, McAllister's mind went cold and clear. They were dead men. The plane was finished. But maybe, just maybe, they could choose how they died. He looked down at the green hell below. And then he looked at the map book had been studying, at a symbol they'd noted earlier. Not a supply dump. Something else. "Gremlin, stop firing! Conserve ammo!" Mac barked, his voice strangely calm. "Book, give me a heading for that river valley. The one with the Japanese forward operating base marked. 5 miles northeast. Now." "Mac, the base is." "Now." "Arthur!" The urgency in Mac's voice cut through the panic. Bellingham, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, scrambled with his charts. "Heading 045. But Mac, we can't bomb it." "We have no bombs?" "We're not carrying bombs," Mac said, wrestling the dying aircraft onto the new heading. The Blenheim, trailing 2 thick plumes of smoke, one black from oil, one white from coolant, lumbered through the sky, a mortally wounded beast. The Zeros out, seeing their prey seemingly in its death throes and changing course away from friendly territory, held back out. They began to circle like wolves waiting for the buffalo to fall. They would watch it crash. There was no need to waste more ammunition. Let the jungle do the work. Inside the shattered cockpit, Mac laid out his insane plan. "They think we're done. They're going to follow us down to confirm the kill. We have one engine failing, the other overheating. We have maybe 5 minutes of flight left, if that. We are not going to crash in the jungle." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "We are going to crash into that Japanese base." The silence on the intercom was absolute, broken only by the scream of damaged engines and the rush of wind through shell holes. "We've got maybe 800 gallons of high-octane fuel left in the tanks," Mac continued, his words clinical, detached. "We're a flying incendiary bomb, if we go in at the right angle. Right into their fuel or ammunition dump. We might just take the whole thing with us." It wasn't a plan. It was a last, grim gesture of defiance, turning their condemned aircraft, their useless Blenheim, into a weapon. Book Bellingham, the teacher, was the first to speak. "The valley is narrow. Approach from the south-southwest. It gives you the longest run, in over the compound." His voice was quiet, resigned, but professional. He had accepted the equation. Gremlin Jones let out a shaky breath. "Well, ain't no one gonna call the Jinx useless after this, skipper. Make it a good fire." The decision was made. There was no debate, no grand speech. Just 3 young men in a broken plane, choosing their final target. Mac pushed the failing starboard engine, begging it for just a few more miles. The Zeros kept their distance, tracking them. Below, the jungle gave way to a cleared area, a dirty scar on the green landscape. They could see huts, trucks, a radio mast, and several large, camouflage storage buildings near a riverbank. The Japanese forward base. It was crawling with ant-like activity. The alarm had clearly been raised. Mac ignored the small, arms fire that began to pepper the air around them. It didn't matter anymore. He lined up the smoking nose of the Blenheim not on a building, but on the space between 2 of the largest storage sheds, where logic dictated they'd store the volatile material. His world narrowed to the windscreen, to the aiming point, to the feel of the controls growing sloppier with every second. The starboard engine let out a final agonized shriek and seized solid. The Blenheim became a glider, a heavy, unstable, burning glider. It began to sink faster. Mac fought to hold the nose up, to maintain just a little more speed. a little more control. The ground rushed up. The Zero pilots, finally sensing this was not a normal crash, dove in for a final, strafing pass. Tracers flew. But it was too late. The Blenheim, Flight Lieutenant James McAllister at the controls, cleared the perimeter fence, its belly scraping the tops of bamboo poles. It was no longer an aircraft. It was a projectile, a 14,000-pound missile, packed with fuel, rage, and futility. Mac pulled back on the yoke one last time, lout, flaring the broken bird just enough to avoid a nose-first impact. The main undercarriage tore away as it hit the ground, out. Then the fuselage slammed into the earth with a sound that tore the sky in half. For a fraction of a second, there was a deafening silence. Then the world exploded. Not just an explosion, loud, but a chain reaction of detonations that rolled across the valley in a single, sustained, apocalyptic roar. The Blenheim's ruptured fuel tanks atomized on impact, creating a vast, rolling cloud of vapor that ignited in a millisecond. This first fireball, white, hot and hundreds of feet wide, engulfed the two storage sheds it had been aimed at, out. But these weren't just sheds holding rice and uniforms. As Mac had hoped, they were the heart of the base's logistical chain. One a fuel depot, the other an ammunition holding area. The initial blast triggered sympathetic detonations inside, out. Drums of aviation gasoline, stacks of artillery shells, crates of small arms ammunition, mortar rounds, out. All of it cooked off in a rapid, catastrophic series of secondary explosions. The ground itself seemed to heave out. A shockwave radiated outward, flattening bamboo huts, flipping trucks onto their backs, and shattering trees at the jungle's edge. The 2-0 pilots, who had pulled up into a climbing turn to avoid the blast, were caught in the turbulent, superheated updraft. Their nimble fighters were tossed like leaves in a gale. One pilot lost control and spiraled into the inferno below. The other, fighting his controls, could only watch in horror as the base disintegrated. The central conflagration was a pillar of churning black smoke and orange flame, reaching thousands of feet into the sky. Smaller, colorful bursts, white phosphorus from signal flares, green from tracer bundles, popped within the maelstrom like malignant fireworks. The riverbank was scorched bare. Everything within a 300-yard radius was simply erased. The concussion was heard by Allied patrols over 20 miles away, who reported a deep, rolling thunder on a clear day. At airfield number 17, a faint rumble was felt hours later, loud, dismissed as distant monsoon thunder. The official Japanese report, what little of it survived the war, would later list the incident as a catastrophic accidental ammunition depot detonation, citing possible negligence, out. There was no mention of a Blenheim, no credit given to a crew. It was as if Mac, Book, and Gremlin had never existed, swallowed whole by the very myth of accident they had created. But stories have a way of leaking out. They travel on the whispers of prisoners, in the diaries of soldiers, out, in the confused after-action reports of enemy commanders. Weeks after the blast, out, a bedraggled Chinese nationalist scout stumbled into an Allied outpost. He had been observing the Japanese base for days. Through his broken English and frantic gestures, out, he told a story that made intelligence officers lean forward in their chairs. He spoke of a great silver bird, trailing smoke and fire, that flew directly into the heart of the enemy camp before the sky fell. His account was filed away, marked, unverified. Probable embellishment. It didn't fit the narrative. Blenheims didn't do that. They got shot down. They were useless. Yet, the physical evidence was undeniable. Subsequent aerial reconnaissance photos showed a blackened scar where the base had been. No activity, no rebuilding. The suspected Japanese push into India from that sector stalled, starved of the supplies that had been vaporized out. The ripple effect of that single, suicidal impact was militarily significant, though no one would ever officially connect the dots. Back at the squadron, L-8752 was simply listed as failed to return out. Presumed lost over enemy territory. McAllister, Bellingham, and Jones were 3 more names on a long, grim roster of the missing. A brief, solemn mess dinner was held. Their personal effects were packed up to be sent home. The war ground on, and their Blenheim was replaced by another worn-out example, destined for the same probable fate. The legend of the flying coffin remained untarnished, but in the minds of the ground crew out, especially Sergeant Jenkins, who had nursed the jinx, a seed of doubt was planted. He'd seen the reconnaissance photos. He'd heard the scout's story. He looked at the next Blenheim being prepped, and for a moment, he didn't see a death trap out. He saw a machine that, in its final second, had been more powerful than any squadron of perfect, pristine bombers out. It was a heresy of thought, and he buried it deep. Yet, the truth was out there, out, waiting in the silence of the jungle and the fading memories of old men. Our story, however, does not end with the fireball out. It takes a sharp turn away from the official records and into the realm of the improbable, the miraculous, the desperately hoped for. Because amidst that utter devastation, amidst the vaporized metal and the burning earth, a tiny pocket of reality defied the physics of the blast. The forward section of the Blenheim's fuselage, from the cockpit to just behind the navigator's station, had been torn clean off in the initial impact and hurled, like a discarded tin can, through the wall of a semi-underground storage bunker made of reinforced logs and earth out. This bunker, designed to withstand bombing, was on the very periphery of the blast zone. It was filled not with explosives out, but with sacks of rice and crates of medical supplies. When the fuselage section smashed into it, it created a cocoon of sorts, a crumpled, burning, but strangely intact metal shell buried within a mound of earth and grain. Inside this shattered tomb, Flight Lieutenant James McAllister regained consciousness. The world was darkness, heat, and a ringing silence that felt absolute. He was upside down, pinned by the twisted control yoke. Pain, a deep, all-encompassing fire, radiated from his shoulder and leg. He tried to move, to call out, but only a choked gasp emerged out. He was drowning in thick, smoky dust. He was certain in hell. But then, a minute later, a beam of light, real out, actual sunlight, stabbed through a rent in the fuselage above him. It illuminated swirling motes of dust, and the crumpled form of Book Bellingham, still strapped in his seat a few feet away out. Book's head lolled, blood crusted on his temple, but as Mac watched, his chest rose and fell. He was alive. A frantic scrabbling sound came from behind, followed by a stream of inventive Liverpool curses. "Get off me, you great sack of blimey!" Gremlin Jones, thrown into the narrow gap behind the cockpit, was wrestling with a burst rice sack that had buried him. He emerged, coughing, his face blackened, one arm hanging at a wrong angle, but his eyes were wide and alert. "Skipper, Book, you alive?" The miracle of their survival was almost immediately overshadowed by the nightmare of their situation. They were in the heart of a destroyed enemy base. The crackle of continuing fires, the shouts of Japanese soldiers, the smell of burning fuel and flesh, it all seeped into their makeshift tomb. They were alive, but trapped, wounded, and surrounded. The initial illusion of death was replaced by a colder, more protracted fear capture, torture, execution out, or burning to death if the fires reached their bunker. Mac, using strength he didn't know he had out, managed to free himself from the wreckage of his seat. His left leg was broken, he was sure of it. He crawled to book out, checking his pulse. Strong. He then assessed their prison. The bunker was partially collapsed, but the earth and rice sacks had absorbed the shock and shielded them from the worst of the heat. Their section of fuselage was their cage, but also their protection. They had a pocket of air, a sliver of light, and a temporary hiding place. "We have to move," Mac hissed, his voice raw. "They'll search the wreckage out. They'll find us." Gremlin, cradling his broken arm, nodded toward the bunker's original entrance, now completely blocked by fallen logs and earth. "Lout. That way's shut tighter than a bank vault on Sunday." He then pointed to the ragged hole their fuselage had made on the way in. It led back outside, into the apocalyptic landscape they had created. It was their only exit. It was also a doorway to certain discovery. They had no weapons besides Gremlin's service revolver, which he'd miraculously kept out, and a flare gun from the plane's emergency kit. That book had the presence of mind to grab as they'd prepared for their final run. It was pitiful. Mac made a decision. They would wait for nightfall. The smoke would provide some cover. Their dark blue RAF uniforms were torn and filthy, offering some camouflage in the shadows. They had to get to the jungle's edge, just 200 yards away, across a blasted, open killing field littered with debris and enemy soldiers. It was another impossible task. But they had already cheated a fireball. What was 200 yards of hell compared to that? As they huddled in the dim hot silence, listening to the shouts grow more organized outside, Mac looked at the crumpled metal around him. This was the Blenheim, the useless one. It had brought them here, to the edge of death. And now, in its final, broken state, it was giving them one last gift, a few more hours of life, and a slim chance to slip away. The Coffin had become a cradle out. The long, terrible Burmese afternoon stretched on. The fires burned lower. The shouts became search commands out. Shadows began to lengthen across the scorched earth. Inside the broken fuselage, 3 men waited for darkness, clinging to a miracle that felt more fragile with every passing minute. Darkness in the jungle is absolute. It descends not as a fading of light, but as a physical presence, a velvety blackness that swallows sound and distance. For Mac, Book, and Gremlin, it was their only ally. Using a shard of aluminum as a makeshift splint for Mac's leg and a sling for Gremlin's arm from a torn parachute harness, they prepared to move. They smeared ash and mud on their faces and uniforms. The plan was simple, born of desperation. Use the chaotic terrain of craters and smoldering wreckage as cover and move in short, silent bursts toward the tree line out. They emerged from their metal womb into a landscape from a nightmare. The air was still oven, hot, thick with the sickly, sweet smell of burned sugar and things best not considered. Glowing embers provided the only light, casting monstrous, dancing shadows. Japanese soldiers, silhouetted against the fires, moved in wary patrols, their focus on the central devastation, not the periphery. For an hour, they became ghosts. They crawled through hot ash, hid behind the skeletal remains of trucks, held their breath as bootsteps crunched past just feet away. Gremlin's knowledge of scrapyards served them well. He could identify which pieces of metal would creak and which would stay silent. Book, despite his head wound, navigated them unerringly toward the darkest patch of jungle. Mac bit down on a leather strap to silence the agony of moving his broken leg. Every inch was a victory. Every shadow a sanctuary. The final 20 yards were the longest of their lives, an open stretch of churned earth under a gibbous moon that chose that moment to emerge from the clouds. They froze pressed into the dirt as a sentry's flashlight beam swept the area. It passed over them, hesitated on a piece of torn blue cloth, then moved on. With a final, excruciating effort, they tumbled into the cool, wet undergrowth of the jungle. They didn't stop. For 2 days and nights, they moved west, following rivers, hiding from patrols, living on siphoned fuel water and handfuls of wild berries. Weakness and infection threatened to claim them. On the third day, delirious and near collapse, they were found not by the enemy, but by a patrol of Gurkhas, whose sharp eyes spotted the unnatural shape of a uniform in the dense foliage. They were carried to safety. They survived the war. Mac, after a long convalescence, flew transports. Book became a cartographer. Gremlin started a garage, fixing cars with the same ingenuity he'd once applied to failing radios. They rarely spoke of that day. The official record never changed. The Bristol Blenheim remained in the history books as a failure, a flawed machine that cost more lives than it saved. And perhaps, on balance, that is the truth. But it is not the whole truth. For in one forgotten corner of a forgotten war, a machine declared useless achieved the impossible. It didn't just destroy a base. It saved, against all odds, the lives of the 3 men who flew it into hell. It proved that courage and desperation can forge a weapon from anything, even from a flying coffin. The Blenheim was never a great plane. But on a moonless night in 1942, one particular Blenheim, and the crew who refused to quit, became something far rarer, a legend, a quiet, uncredited, burning legend that whispers still that value is not always written in the specifications, but sometimes in the moments of impossible, defiant grace.